Yes, so welcome everyone. We are Alfredo Ramirez and Clara Lorid. We teach here at the Architectural Association in a master's program called Landscape Urbanism. And we are also part of the Root and Branch Collective that I will introduce in a second. First of all, I thank you very much to the AA and the public program for organizing. Thanks to the Root and Branch Collective, all the contributors, all of you who are here. And I'll start by introducing the Root and Branch Collective, that is a scholar, activist, transdisciplinary group dedicated to research and action for a radical agrarian studies approach geared specifically to the political ecology of Europe. And as one of our colleagues from Root and Branch, Patrick Besnihan and Naomi Milner wrote in All We Want is the Earth, building a viable planetary future will involve becoming part of struggles that may at first seem unrelated to environmentalism, struggles over land, labor, and decolonization. And these words more or less resonate with the structure of the program today. If you have any questions, it's in the door, the details of the program. And the event is structured in 3 sessions with short presentations. Each session would have a slightly different format according to what the contributors and the moderators thought about it. But we really want to make it open to everyone for questions, comments. We have also set up these whiteboards with very strong magnets so that you can add any comments, questions, or if you don't like the microphones, you can just use the Post-its, and we will use these comments for the conclusions at the end of the event. There's also a stay in contact page in the table if you want to leave your contact details, because the Root and Branch Collective, we want to build connections, resonances across movements and organizations, and use this event to do that. In this whiteboard, we have 2 questions about what do we want to build, achieve, encourage people to think about differently today and perhaps in the future. And another very important question, like where do we go next? What are the future actions and takeaways from this event? And then in that board, you have the 3 themes and sessions, which are land, labor, and anti-imperialism. There will be lunch, coffee breaks, drinks at the end, so there will be space for those very important conversations. And we would like everyone to use like accessible and respectful language. And yeah, I think that's it from me. Do you want to?
Yeah, just quickly to explain why we're doing this event at the AA and why it's relevant for architects and designers. So within fields, professions, and disciplines such as architecture and landscape-oriented design and urbanism, which are traditionally and conventionally focused on issues around the urban and the city, it is for us very fundamental to center the agrarian land, the agrarian workers, and agrarian anti-imperialism movements. When some of these topics are occasionally discussed within architecture, it is by using terms like urban agriculture, regenerative or organic agriculture, which usually sidelines or completely ignores issues such as labor exploitation, like in the case of the migrant exploitation in this country, the privatization of land and the impossibility to access to land, especially by marginalized communities, as well as its dependence on the development of the global south. There is also, from my perspective, a lack of awareness of the need of a land reform in the UK, where almost 70% of the land is agrarian and 50% of the land is owned by 1% of the population. There is an urgent need to link the fact that, for example, the UK imports most of its fruits and vegetables from abroad, and understand how the forced underdevelopment of global south and the extraction of cheap labor, land, energy, and resources from those countries is what maintains the food and associated industries and modes of life afloat here in the UK. It is also important, we find this as we see this as an opportunity to present agroecology as part of a larger and broader land and agrarian struggles, land, labor, and anti-imperialism, rather than a Western neutral and sanitized imaginary that offers false choices and solutions. And finally, there shouldn't be any land and agrarian struggle symposium without locating and highlighting the centrality of Palestine and the struggle for liberation, which is the struggle of land, agrarian, urban, and other landscapes. So Gaza ongoing genocide is a painful reminder of the need to understand the interconnectedness of all these struggles, land and labor, and anti-imperialism struggle, as fundamental to any serious engagement to the current predicaments we face and the need of our involvement as designers and to support, to be able to offer alternative futures. Yeah, that's all. So, the first one? Mm-hmm. The first one.
Yeah, so Olivia.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that really wonderful introduction, Clara and Alfredo. Really excited to be chairing the first panel today. One of our presenters, Naomi, is going to be speaking to us remotely from Aberdeen, and the other two here, Kier and Christabel, I will leave to introduce themselves. So I'll just briefly open with a sort of introduction to why, elaborating on what's already been said, why we have to talk about land and talk about property relations when we are thinking about agrarian struggles. So I have to sit up really straight to be able to speak into this microphone. So is the UK an agricultural nation? It's a question that I ask myself sometimes. In 2023, agriculture employed 462,100 people across the UK, 1.4% of the workforce. In England specifically, that number was only 285,000 or 0.85%, compared with retail and wholesale, which is 12.8% of the workforce, or manufacturing 6%, or education 8.2%. It seems that this might not be a significant sector. In 2023, agriculture contributed £13.7 billion, or 0.56% of the UK's annual GDP. This is the lowest contribution of any industry, less than half as much as the next smallest industry. So if you look at these two measures, we might be forgiven for thinking that the UK is just about as far from an agricultural nation as it's possible to be. But as Alfredo mentioned, things start to look a little bit different when we appreciate that while it may not employ that many people or make that much money, UK farms nonetheless produce a little over 50% of all the food eaten in the UK. And if we look at how much land agriculture uses, a very different picture emerges. 17 million hectares, or around 70% of the UK's total land area, is used for agriculture. So the struggle over land in this country is necessarily an agrarian struggle. And on the flip side, the agrarian struggle is a struggle over land. Who controls it, who profits from it, and who is exploited in its use? Who has access and who is excluded? Who buys it and who sells it? And who gets to decide? This is a struggle not only over questions of access, of making farm tenancies more secure, or of crafting new kinds of mortgage to allow more new entrants to buy their own farms, or convincing existing landholders to share what they have. It's a struggle over property. In other words, it's a struggle over the very nature of the norms, rules, and laws that determine how our society relates to and governs the world around us. Property in this country is often assumed to be synonymous with ownership, and ownership comes with strict boundaries and powerful rights. The right to exclude others, to make unilateral decisions, to sell the land when and how the owner wants, and to profit exclusively from the use and value of land. But it also comes with vulnerabilities that are made invisible in popular discourses about the so-called security brought by ownership. The owner is subject to market and other forces which may force her hand, limiting her decision-making power and forcing her to sell when she doesn't want to. But the thing is that ownership is not the only form of property. Other rules and norms are possible. Norms where exclusive authority is limited by the authority of the collective, and where land can be transferred to others who need it but not sold, where the benefits of its use are distributed. These different ways of doing property exist in our history, and they exist now in places both here and around the world, though beset on all sides by the encroaching power of the ownership model and the capitalist world system of which it's part. This dimension of agrarian struggle is often overlooked. In an analysis of 120 documents from key UK organisations that advocate for food system change, I found that words relating to property relations were mentioned least out of all domains of agroecological transformation. I think this invisibility of property is beginning to change, though, and I'm excited to hear now from our three wonderful speakers, starting with Naomi, who are going to tell you about their work in and on the land and about struggles that are taking place across the UK today. Naomi, hopefully you're there. Go ahead.
Chance to test out the hearing, so let me know if this works, please. Can you see my slide?
We can hear you, but we can't see your slide.
Okay, well, I've screen shared it, perhaps we're just waiting, or perhaps the technical facility is not there.
Oh, there we go. Yep, now we can see it.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'll be mindful if there's a delay. So thank you, Olivia, for inviting me to speak today alongside some passionately compelling scholar activists. And I'm very grateful to the organizing committee for dealing with all this tech and facilitating my talk online. I'm sorry I couldn't join all of you in person. So if you recall the event description, I'm going to talk about the, quote, imagination hampering aspects facing land struggles in Scotland. And I apologize for starting us off on perhaps a bit of a grim note. I came to Scotland from Canada 2 years ago to work at the James Hutton Institute because I was inspired by Scottish land reform. And I still believe it is one of the best examples of large-scale agrarian change in the global north. But it seems to me that its promise has not been fulfilled, and there is much more that needs to be done to meet its own goals, let alone achieving radically just futures. So what is the problem with land ownership in Scotland? There's a remarkable concentration of private ownership. So 83% of Scotland is rural land, and half of that is owned by only 432 landowners, and that's fewer, down from 440 in 2012. And just 16 owners of 10% of land. You can see that graphic along the bottom that displays the number of owners and goes up in 10% increments. So these issues are compounded by the unregulated land market. There's no limits on non-Scottish ownership or the amount of land that can be owned, and there's no land value tax. There's a lack of transparency of ownership. Ownership data is incomplete. You have to search for it in several different registries. And there's a lack of accountability by private landowners. So the Scottish Land Commission, which was established after the Land Reform Bill in 2016, says that while there are some benefits in economies of scale, and I'll note here that Scottish Land and Estates, which is an owner advocacy group, often says that large estates can most efficiently carry out environmental actions on a landscape scale. So while there may be some benefits in economies of scale, there are significant risks of concentrated power and evidence that this is having adverse impacts in some places. So, enter land reform. A friend recently told me a story about a gathering she attended at the home of a titled family sometime in the past, although not this far back in the past, where land reform came up, and in the discussion, Scotland was referred to as the Zimbabwe of the North. And this struck me just a bit ridiculous when you consider that land reform essentially boils down to private ownership by communities who are now able to buy land on the open market with some financial support. And I mean, of course, this is a simplification. The law in 2003 created broad access rights to land in Scotland, the right to roam and even camp. Rural communities were given the right to buy, which was extended to urban communities in 2015. There are options for compulsory sale of abandoned and neglected land made possible in 2015, and compulsory sale to further sustainable development in 2016, although I believe that's never been used. There may be one recent use case. The Scottish Land Fund was created in 2000 to provide support for community acquisitions. But I think that the folks at the pot gathering hit upon something that Scotland's land reform legislation and apparatus have shied away from, and that's the acknowledgement that land is power. It seems in the legislation to be seen primarily as a resource for circumscribed community development. And you can see that in the 1998 pre-land reform quote on the slide that references the objectives of fairness, public good, local enterprise, and sustainable populations. Empirically, community land ownership has increased by 23% in the last 12 years, but it only accounts for 2.8% of all rural land. And many think that the low-hanging fruit, such as the crofting and island estates, has already been picked. And many of those acquisitions, by the way, were accomplished without using land reform mechanisms, either prior to or since. The consultation on the bill that's referenced in the top right box on the slide, that was just tabled last March, had other goals for land reform. These included increasing diversity of land ownership, bringing about changes in land use to address environmental goals around biodiversity and climate change, and to create more opportunities for communities to engage in decision-making about the land around them and share in the benefits they bring. So why this kind of expanded focus and the change here? In the broader context, we see a lot of the socioeconomic and environmental trends that in Scotland across the global north. So rising land prices, increasing land concentration, difficulty of land access for new entrants, and shrinking rural communities. The environmental trends include declining biodiversity, degraded peatland, monocultural land uses, vulnerability to climate change, and high emissions from land use. Policy-wise in Scotland, the government has committed to becoming a net zero society by 2045. And in that aim, they're offering support for carbon sequestration, such as woodland expansion and peatland restoration. And Scottish agriculture support is being restructured to focus more on environmental outcomes, although the deadline for that seems to be farther and farther in the future. A think tank recently proposed that to bridge the nature finance gap, whereby the public does not have enough money to accomplish these goals, the nature finance gap will cost an estimated £20 billion, and the Scottish Government does expect private finance to fill that gap. So growth of this market for carbon sequestration and ecological restoration has led to an increased demand for land ownership for these purposes, which goes right back to the point at the beginning of this slide, rising land prices and difficulty for new entrants. This is a snapshot of rural land-related headlines since I arrived in Scotland. Some of the splashier aspects of these trends get more news coverage, such as investment firms and wealthy individuals buying up land for carbon credits, renewable energy use of land, or the splashier people get press, like the Brewdog CEO, top right. We were asked by the Scottish Government in 2023 to carry out some research on the socioeconomic impacts of this trend of green land investment in Scotland. So we carried out 6 case studies across the country with interviews and workshops with community members, farmers, crofters, land workers, and green investor owners. So we defined green land investment as the purchase of or investment in land directly through shareholding or changing focus of the owner investment, or indirectly through intermediary companies, to undertake activities such as nature restoration, regenerative land management, or approaches that maintain or enhance natural capital and or sequester carbon emissions. And this is taking place in every part of Scotland, rural Scotland. And I've included a basic summary of our findings about the perceived benefits and negative impacts that we heard from our participants. These don't apply in every case, but they were seen more than once. So the benefits included increased accessibility, transparency, and community engagement in some cases, investor owner support for education and training for land use activities, as well as community housing, some financial and in-kind support for local community initiatives, and increased tourism activity and employment. And you can see how for some populations, these benefits could actually have some negative impact as well. The negative impacts included employment loss, out-migration of communities, and the subsequent impact on services, decrease of housing availability, threats to recreational access, negative aesthetic impact on landscapes, and the one that was emphasized across all cases was lack of community involvement in land use decision-making. Also, in all case studies, there was a loss of farms. So I like the definition of power by Pluso and Berbeau. It is the capacity of some actors to affect the practices and ideas of others. And the relative power of wealthy green land investor owners was expressed in our research as a key concern. Thus, the callback on this slide to Scotland's feudal past in the term green lairds, and the media used that term quite frequently in 2021 to 22. So all of what I'm about to say about the largest landowner of Scotland is easily found in newspapers and other public documents. I'm using him as a thought experiment. Anders Paulsen, a Danish fast fashion tycoon, owned 88,000 hectares of the 13 estates, including the pip that you see on the map, which comprise just over 50% of his total amount of land in the north of Scotland there. He has a 200-year vision of landscape-scale conservation in the Scottish Highlands, where his company will, quote, work to let nature heal, grow, and thrive. And he also says they, quote, have an even greater commitment to the concept of community, end quote. So examples of his capacity to affect the practices of others that have made the news. He is the biggest shareholder in North Coast 500 Tourism Initiative, which has had a massive impact on the area in terms of tourist traffic. He has built and renovated many properties on his estates for luxury accommodation. On the map, you can see kind of the main roads there in red and white check that many of them, if you're accessing the north, you are going through his land. He, in the village of Tongue, circled there on the right-hand side, he has bought the only petrol station, the garage, and the 2 shops in the village. And he is having the new care home site relocated. It was formerly overlooked by his luxury hotel. He has likewise opposed neighboring estates' spaceport and wind farm plans in court, unsuccessfully as it turns out, because they disrupt his view or his vision. So Josh Doble from Community Land Scotland said, local people are wary of speaking out against someone as powerful as Paulsen, who can use his wealth to fund local services like a doctor's surgery or care home to curry favor with local service providers and politicians. It can lead to a dangerous situation in which a powerful landowner could feel untouchable. A monopoly landowner such as Anders Paulsen in Tongue does not build community wealth, is not empowering communities. It is the same dynamic that has existed for hundreds of years. As a community workshop participant put it to us, they are still up there and we are still down here and we're at their mercy. So what can land reform do about a situation like this? You may be thinking this situation is extreme or atypical. Obviously, with the largest landowner, there are some uniquenesses to it, but please recall the negative impacts that we saw across our 6 cases and also the impact on land markets. Will the tabled bill address the power of landowners that is inherent in property rights, as Olivia mentioned, the right to exclude, the wealth and the status that accrues to these landowners, and the resulting influence on discourse, the power over landscape scale planning and change? The tabled bill gives Scottish ministers the power to do a few things. One is to require that a land management plan be produced by the landowner and regularly reviewed for all large-scale land holdings, and in this case, that's defined as greater than 3,000 hectares. There are approximately 414 of those in Scotland. As the bill thus stands, there's some definitional quibbling going on, and there's a fine of £5,000 for failure to comply with making this land management plan. There's nothing yet about whether you have to follow it. And second, the bill requires that owners who intend to transfer all or part of a large landholding, in this case over 1,000 hectares, must notify the Scottish government in advance. So this prevents off-market sales and it gives community bodies an opportunity to try and buy the land. The land also can't be transferred without an application to ministers for a decision on whether to subdivide it into lots to sell it to different purchasers. And if this lowers the value of land, the government must compensate owners for loss or expense. If applied over the last 3 years, this provision would mean that 8 sales per year would be affected. You can probably see that there are some criticisms of these very modest changes. The bill did not incorporate certain parts of the government's own consultation proposals and Scottish Land Commission recommendations. So there's no public interest test, which would have regulated the buyer. There's no strengthening of the land rights and responsibilities statement. The Scottish Land Commission wanted it to be statutory rather than just guidance. And there was no restricting land ownership to EU and UK registered entities, for example. Finally, I have to note that under these land reform provisions, past and present, land must be bought by geographical communities, not, say, communities of interest. So in the case of Paulsen's wildland, with the population of the greater area of Sutherland, around 12,000 people, it's unclear how that would work. With the 200-year vision, when would land be sold? Could a compulsory sale be forced on sustainability grounds? If it was put up for sale, would the geographical community have the capacity, money, skills, knowledge, or time to pursue it? And leaving Paulson aside, will any significant change occur when the principal is willing buyer, willing seller? Is ownership truly diversified if it is all private, no matter who the owners are? Can legal forms be anything but reforms be anything but reformist? I think the answer is probably in the wording there.
Naomi, could I ask you to just finish up in the next minute or two?
Yeah, this is my last slide.
Thank you.
I've talked a lot about ownership, but I think tenure is a more useful frame, and it shows us the things in the system that can change and things that don't change. So land tenure is the terms and conditions on which land is held, used, and transacted within a particular system of rights and institutions that govern access to and use of land. This encompasses various aspects of control over and use of land. So land regimes basically are social relations between people. And a crucial element is those institutions and the norms that support and justify the relationships of ownership and control. These aren't just the legal system, government, education, but also cultural values, approved land uses. And cultural values and a callback to the clearances were a major factor in gaining support for land reform at the beginning of it. And I think this shows us some trigger points for change. So I've got a quote by geographer Nick Blomley here: just as the convergence of state power and territory has a history, so too does the changing conjunction of property and territory. A product of social processes and social struggle, it can be remade differently. So I'm going to leave the how of that up to our next speakers and maybe some questions after, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. That was really excellent. I did not want to interrupt you. So now I think Christabel is going to speak. Good luck telling us how we're going to do that. Yeah, go for it. I'll try to give you a warning when you're almost done.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I actually love PowerPoint, so I don't know why I didn't make one, but yeah. So yeah, I'm Christabel. I work in movement building, so I support the land justice movement in the UK to do what it's doing and also to kind of build more interconnections between all of the different struggles that make up land justice. I work for an organisation called Shared Assets.
Closer to the mic.
Oh, is that on? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I work for an organisation called Shared Assets. It's a very small community interest company. And yeah, what we're trying to do ultimately is to create a more sustainable and just land system in the UK. It began as an organisation that was working with landowners and local authorities and community groups to try and work out different ways of bringing land into the common good. But it's moved much more towards like this conception that actually without a movement behind it, we're never going to change the land system. We're only going to have reformist measures or very small insulated action to change the land system. It's not going to overthrow it. So yeah, an important part of this work is to slowly bring the most marginalised people, the people who are most marginalised by the current land system, into shaping the movement and into therefore shaping the solutions to the problem. So to do that, we try to broaden the land justice movement. So that's also going from like, what do we think land justice is? And then being like, is that everybody who's deciding what that is? The answer often is no. To deepen relationships for the long term. This is a struggle that's going to be centuries long. We're not going to change it in our generation. And to become more equitable in what we're doing and how we're organising. We call this infrastructure in a movement. So that is kind of providing support for organisations to form. We have governance expertise, so we give mentorship to new organisations. So, for example, Land in Our Names began as a small organisation that needed some fiscal support and mentoring. Shared Assets was able to do that at the time. We also support organisations to convene. So I guess we view the land justice movement as kind of like an ecosystem of people and organisations. And so we bring people together in order to create the synergies and strategies to be able to like work together, but with difference. Like we are going to be finding difference. We're going to be maybe working towards the same vision or visions, but we're going to be working with a lot of difference, and I'll come on to that later. because we're small, we've been mostly working in England, but we do have some work in Scotland. One of the people who works for the organisation now is based in Scotland. But yeah, we also understand that there are colonial land dynamics there, and we're going to come up against them in the land justice movement. So yeah, I don't know, I guess like people understand like what's going on with land, but I wanted to give like a quick summary. So yeah, further concentration. Over 65% of land in England is owned by aristocrats, oligarchs, city bankers, and corporations. So these are unaccountable wealth hoarders. And people find themselves pushed onto the margins more and more. So I guess if you're doing like urban agriculture, you'll probably understand like community gardens and the struggle that community gardens have of just retaining space. So that's happening not just with space, but also with communities, with public services like libraries and community centres, with county farms. Like there's just a huge sell-off of land that we can access. I think a thing that like local groups are finding in the land justice movement is like just finding places to meet that aren't commodified. So like actually organising is a land justice issue. Like where do we actually meet without paying huge sums of money? And housing crisis. I think like this is often people think of land justice as about land that land workers are on, but housing is a massive issue, and it's obviously like an urban and a rural issue, but it's much more intense in urban spaces. The conditions are worsening, and like that just shows landlord power. And so I guess it's about landowners and landlords. Well, that's what we're talking about. That's who we're struggling against. And working with at times, but yeah, the kind of property ownership of like urban landlords as well. And I think if you look at that, you can see how classist and racialized land injustice is. With people who are getting benefits can't rent often, and people who are like recent migrants also struggling to rent. Trespass and criminalisation, so rights of way are disappearing. This is a big topic, right? Trespass. People have probably heard of right to roam. And we could save them if we organise, and like the Ramblers have a big campaign for that. But also there's the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, it's now an act, which criminalises travellers and their way of life in a new way. We have new developments which privatise where we walk, and therefore the jurisdiction of like if you do something wrong, you can be trialed as a criminal rather than under civic law. And it's much more than that as well. There's mega prisons being built, and there's like AI centres that are being built. This is all land justice issues. So it sounds really bad. But at the same time, there's a growing land justice movement emerging in the UK. And first of all, I'm just going to say a bit about land justice, what it means. So it's being defined and redefined by the land justice movement. A couple of years ago, this was a definition that was come up with. Everyone deserves to belong to the land, and the land belongs to everyone. But at its root, it's challenging private property. It's more than just land reform, and it's not just agricultural land. So it's about like people advocating to make decisions about how land is used and moving from ownership towards the commons. It's using a justice framework to understand how we want to change the land system and who is part of that. So it's imagining and how we recreate the world that we want to see. It's recognising that right now not all people have equal access, use and decision-making power over land, and that there are many structural barriers that people face. There's like a really good report out on how black people and people of colour don't have access to land. It's called the Jumping Fences report. I encourage you to look that up. But it's not just people of colour who have skewed access to land. It's a social justice issue, and it's underpinning many struggles. Basically, we can't have food justice and we can't have climate justice unless we have land justice. And I kind of talked a bit about like prisons. Prison abolition is like becoming a bit more part of like the conversations that we're having. Reparations, so that's about like how do we redistribute land, understanding the colonial history of land injustice and what black people and people of colour in the UK might need in order to heal and repair from that history and the intergenerational trauma. And yeah, it's a global struggle. Like, it doesn't just begin and end at the borders of the UK. And also, as I said, the UK has its own colonial history. So yeah, land theft is colonial and neo-colonial, and we are at the centre of an empire. And these are all the things that we're grappling with as a land justice movement at the moment. So yeah, so the land justice movement is like kind of how we're trying to change this. Yeah, it's a network which has a legacy. It's a movement which has a legacy. I mean, probably that goes back beyond what I'm going to talk about. But before I started this work, there was a land justice network that was quite active, like working in different regions of the UK, and asking the question of land for what? Like, what do we want land for? How do we start making decisions about what we use it for and who owns it? And then, like, land for who started, it was the next question that people were asking of, like, not everybody's here, and why is that? And I think this is a common thing with movements, is that lots of people are left out, especially in this country. It's often like white and middle class people who start to mobilise, or are the most visible people who are mobilising, and that, yeah, it's about kind of broadening that out, or like making sure that, like, yeah, that it's not centralised around those people. So yeah, it's, at the moment, one of the missions is to build coalitions, so like a shared strategy where people are working on different things but see the need for each other to build collective power. And this is the ecosystemic approach, that, like, all of us have different tactics and different strategies, but how do we support each other in those and move together? One of the things we've been doing is having a national gathering every year, and Shared Assets have been curating the invite list for this, which I think the reason we decided to do that was that, like, people turning up often are just like, they're not necessarily representative of the whole movement. So we've been making sure that there's more racial justice issues there, abolitionist issues, yeah, that reparations is put on the agenda. And actually, like, a couple of years ago, we were holding the gathering a bit more tightly, and we have this saying of, like, let's move at the pace of trust, let's not leave people behind. It's an Adrienne Marie Brown saying, if you've ever heard of her. And yeah, at some point we got kind of interrupted, and people were like, well, you're moving too fast, why are we doing strategy now? Like, we need to understand each other, what our core values are, do we all have the same values or not? And like, that, I think, was a demonstration of how it is possible to kind of let go of control and for people to take ownership of the process as well. So in a way, it was, like, really positive. Yeah, and so kind of this broadening that we're doing is also to kind of understand that there are lots of different narratives out there, and to change the narrative around land. So yeah, what we see and what we hear about is often just the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, the kind of Right to Roam campaign is really powerful and really good, and it activates people, it mobilises, but it is just like a narrow issue, and it is just a single campaign. And yeah, yeah, so our role, I guess, is to kind of support the development of these movement structures so that a more diverse leadership can come in, so that there's political education about all of these different issues that span across the whole of land justice, and that we support strategy eventually when people are ready. And there's, like, a lot of learning that goes on inside the movement. So, like, how do we reform relationships with land? Like, do we bring in spirituality? Like, how do we do that without access? Like, all this kind of stuff. New models of land stewardship, so community land trusts, housing co-ops and networking around that. Different, like, yeah, different kind of modes of, like, tenureship. And then trying to kind of bring all of this into a common vision, so it's not just like blueprints of models, but like, what is the end goal? Yeah, and so the challenges, I guess, are just a few of these. Basically, coalition building is really hard work, but strategy is essential. So yeah, like I said, we need time to trust each other, to build meaningful coalitions, but there's so many different people in the room that actually finding a shared identity to mobilize behind is kind of impossible. And yeah, we have this kind of working value statement so that we're not going to kind of keep going back to like what are our values each time we meet. And I think that is one of the problems, is that because we're time poor as people who are like really committed to this, and because we're like resource poor, we can't find spaces to meet that don't cost the earth. Like we have this limited time together, but we still want to be like, okay, who are we? Let's talk about our values when we meet. But if we keep doing that every time, it doesn't feel like we're progressing. So we've got this working value statement now that will be like continue from every time we meet. And yeah, the movement is still kind of dispersed and fragmented. And one of the challenges is to kind of make sure that it doesn't become divided. So to kind of reckon with some of the stuff that's coming up around, like, how do we bring reparative justice into our movement spaces? It doesn't always feel easy and comfortable to be in kind of mixed racialized spaces, even though we bring like caucus spaces in, which is like a kind of mode of doing reparative justice. Yeah, I think that does create tensions, and one of the things that we're like wrangling with at the moment is like, how do we kind of organize with race and power at the center of like what we do and what we're working towards. 1 minute, great. And yeah, and I think like the Land Justice Network before did fall apart because of some of the divisions. So I think like that's something that we're quite conscious of as well. And like, yeah, trying to kind of keep active and like keep motivated around such a broad church or like a movement of movements is like also quite difficult, because people feel inspired by campaigns, but we can't just be a movement of single campaigns. I think like that's pretty much it. Yeah, and there is this quote that I really like from an Oregon group in the United States, but it's like, we can begin shifting from a Western approach of preserving to an approach of being in the right relationship, like preserving land as in conserving it. And I guess one of the issues is like a big thing that's advocated is like nature reconnection or kind of rewilding, and this is kind of critiquing that as colonial. So like we can begin shifting from a Western approach of preserving to an indigenous approach of being in the right relationship with land, water, plants and animals. So yeah, I'm going to leave you with that.
That's great. That's really great, really amazing to hear about everything that you're doing in supporting that movement building work. And now we're going to hear from Keir, who's going to, I think, talk about something that's both similar and quite different, thinking about the sort of maybe more programmatic or institutional forms that this vision for land system change might take.
So yeah, should we switch?
I'll take the hot seats. Thanks.
Well done.
Oh, there it is. Perfect. Great. Let's see.
Bye.
Hi, thanks. Sorry about that brief interlude. So my name's Keir Milburn, and I'm from a relatively new organisation called Abundance. And today I'm going to be presenting little bits from this brand new report, Food Systems in Common, Council Farms, Agroecological Food Sovereignty and Public Common Partnerships. It's so new, in fact, it just got launched this morning. We rushed it out especially, partly for this symposium, but also partly because of the farmers' protests around inheritance tax. There's so much focus on farming. We wanted to make a sort of proposition of what we could, how we could think about food systems in the UK and how they might change. This sort of builds on work that we at Abundance have been doing for several years around this idea of public-common partnerships, which I'll explain shortly. And we've been working across various sectors of the economy, like urban development, pharmaceutical production, energy systems, and also we've been working around food systems to some degree. And so this new report, it sort of makes this proposition actually that public common partnerships could be a form through which, in fact, public common partnerships around council farms or county farms, as Christabel called them, that could be one intervention, one way into starting or thinking about how we transform food systems in the UK into a more agroecological sort of mode and more democratic mode of organisation and production. I should make it clear that I'm not the main author of this report. That's Kai Heron, my colleague, friend and comrade Kai, and he sort of leads on our food systems work. He'd be much better placed to present this report. Unfortunately, Kai, no, that's not the right word. Fortunately, Kai and his partner Sarah had their first baby, Isla, a couple of weeks ago, so Kai probably quite literally has his hand full at this moment. So I won't be taking any detailed questions. I'm just going to be talking in vague terms. I hope you accept that. So this is just released today. It's available on our website, which is not on that slide because I rushed these slides together quickly. But if you go to in-abundance.org, you'll be able to find that report and download it, and you'll be able to just read that and skip my own contributions. And if you went there, you'd see this description, this sort of mission statement from Abundance, which says, Abundance promotes public common strategies to democratise the economy and support a just ecological transition for everyone. I'm going to talk about the report shortly, and if I have time, I'll just quickly mention some work we've been doing on the Isle of Skye with an organisation, Climbivore, and my friend Daniel Fernandez Pascual, who's in the audience here. I don't know if we'll get to that. I've got 15 slides and 15 minutes. I don't think we're going to get to it, but perhaps we'll have a little skip through and have a look at some pictures. So I'm going to talk about that report in a moment. We've had a very busy week at Abundance. Not only have we published this report, but we've just handed in the manuscript for this book. It's not out until next September, but we're quite excited about it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, Radical Abundance, How to Win a Green Democratic Future. I'm going to talk a little bit about that to explain the framing upon which we approach our work. Also, it's my first opportunity to talk about this manuscript, so I'm quite excited about it. So we're calling it Radical Abundance, and in some sort of ways it's an attempt to cut through what we think is quite a stale debate that's been going on for a while, or become even more staler, between what you might call eco-modernism and perhaps degrowth communism, or just degrowth altogether. We want to sort of cut through that and repose this question about what's the point of economic activity? You know, if we want abundance, well, what sort of abundance do we want? And to do that, we make this distinction between what we call bullshit abundance, which we're against. I don't know if anyone got that. Bullshit abundance and radical abundance, which we're for. And when we talk about bullshit abundance, we're talking about the kinds of economic activity, the kinds of products, the kinds of services, the kind of externalities, as it would be put, that result from orienting our economic activity and coordinate our economic activity around the needs of capital and capital's need to grow, capital's dynamic of self-expansion, etc. We'd argue that capital's need to grow subordinates the more direct addressing of human need, and not just human need, but human need in its the needs of human beings and the flows of energy and matter between human and non-human nature. So we would talk about bullshit abundance in terms of capital's metabolic control, the metabolism between human and non-human nature, which is transhistorical. and capital's domination of that is just a particular instance of a transhistorical relation. Of course, we don't just live in a world of abundance, bullshit or otherwise. We also live in a world of incredible scarcities. And, you know, we want to make this argument that bullshit abundance also goes along, is always paired with the creation of artificial scarcities, a sort of dialectical relation. And in food systems, there's all sorts of ways you could parse this, I think. But in food systems, you could sort of say, well, look, you know, you walk into the supermarket, you see an abundance of fruit and veg, and you realize actually, or you could easily realize that that is in fact dependent on food scarcity in other parts of the world, or even perhaps food scarcity amongst different classes in the UK, etc. But that's not the only scarcity that you might have when you look at that huge abundance of fruit and veg. In fact, what you're seeing is a real lack of diversity of the wide scale of potential fruit and veg. That fruit and veg is not there because it tastes particularly nice. It's not there because it would satisfy this desire that we might have for really tasty vegetables and fruit. It's there because it has the characteristics which suit the dynamics of capital. It will stay on the shelf for a long time. It can be transported, etc., etc. Perhaps it's regular in shape. So these sorts of dynamics. And we contrast that with this idea of radical abundance, in which we would say, instead of capital's control over social metabolism, we'd need a communal control over social metabolism. Ultimately, that means that we need to directly have economic activity which directly addresses human need and addresses the metabolism between human and non-human, directly addresses that. And that would indicate some form of democratic planning, I think. In fact, we would just make this argument that the problems such as climate change and ecological limits, that just automatically demands some form of economic coordination via planning. That's what cap and trade is. That's what the cap is. You can, if you want, you can do economic planning, then hang some preposterous market mechanisms underneath that, which is what cap and trade is. But like that, it's just given in the problem, basically. And you can have technocratic planning. You can have technocratic planning with market mechanisms slapped on in order to try to perpetuate the inequalities of society, or you can have democratic planning. And I think that's the direction we need to move the economy in. And in fact, we want to subordinate capital's control of the metabolism we want to subordinate that gradually over time to the social control of the metabolism. I'm not going to get through 15 slides. No. Of course, there's been lots of propositions for how the world could be organised in a different way. One of the lacks we found when we've looked through all of the different propositions is a theory of transition, of how you would get there. And so this is what we try to offer in the book, is a theory of transition in which we want to bring more and more areas of economic activity, social reproduction, and the communal control and out of the direct control of capital. We want to bring more and more economic activity into a space of contested reproduction, where we're contesting with capital over the control over how we reproduce ourselves, etc. You could do that via nationalisation. That's what happened with nationalisation in the post-war period. But we think that doesn't address one of the other problems, the other facets of transition, which is the need to inculcate popular protagonism, people's control over their own lives, a collective control of decision-making over their own lives. I'll skip bits of this. Just to quickly introduce public-common partnerships. One of the ways to think about that, the easiest way to get your head around what a public-common partnership is a reverse engineer of public-private partnerships. We know those are through PFIs, etc. We're just about to get a huge new wave of them through the Labour Party, through this idea of de-risking, etc. Swiftly on. And so the public-common partnership is this a sort of mode of co-ownership and co-management of an industry, an asset or a service by three distinct mutually supporting groups, some sort of relevant state authority at the relevant level, the employees are equivalent of an organisation or a project or an enterprise, and then this independently constituted common association, which is like a democratic body that controls the democratic deliberates of the investment of surplus, which would lead to this very self-explanatory diagram in which each letter would be a public common partnerships and each arrow or cycle would be an investment cycle. So public common partnership A would help to try to capitalise public common partnership B. That's a self-expansive dynamic of the commons to combat the self-expansive dynamic of capital. Right, the introduction's out of the way. Throat clearing out the way. 3 minutes left. So we want to propose council farms or county farms as perhaps one sort of way in which you could do this to try to help argue for local authorities to create public common partnerships around council farms. And you could, if we manage to do this, we might be able to set up council farms as sort of like laboratories and lighthouses for a sort of agroecological transition, if you want to put it that way. And we've gone a little bit further in this report. We've tried to think about, well, how would that fit into a sort of reshaping of food systems, perhaps in the immediate term on a local authority level, where the local authority has a variety of council farms, county farms, but on a national level as well, possibly. And so we want to go to this very nice engineering diagram. I'm not going to have time to talk through all of that, but I'll talk through a little bit of this. And you can see council farms up here as element 3 on the diagram. All of those are sort of feeding through to something called a food sovereignty council. The words joint enterprise and national have now been eliminated. Please ignore those words. We were rushing to get this report out and we failed to eliminate that in the slides. What I would say about this, though, is that if you want to think about a food sovereignty council, we think of this as a democratic body responsible for governing the social, ecological, and food production objectives of all of the participating council farms. It's something like we're trying to set the objectives for the local authority as a whole, perhaps, which then the food that the county or council farms will take notice of. And so the council or county farms, they'll be able to manage their own farms and their own affairs in whatever way they would like. They decide on how the farms are run, but they're trying to meet the objectives set by the Food Sovereignty Council. Now, they feed into the governance of the Food Sovereignty Council, but there's other items that would also feed in, such as a local authority. And then you notice this very strange organisation called the Common Food Association. Now, that would be the equivalent of this Commons Association or Common Association we've talked about in public common partnerships before. So this would be a body which would be made up of either people from the local area, and they would have a subscription, a little bit like a CSA actually. You'd get food back for that subscription, but you'd also have some sort of governance rights over the Food Sovereignty Council. The other tier of membership in that would be the local authorities' anchor institutions, perhaps the hospital and the schools, etc. And once again, they'd have some sort of say in the Food Sovereignty Council, and they would also receive food back in order to fulfil their functions, etc. So the Food Sovereignty Council, in return for this, in return for these farms, giving over some level of control, they would also be a way of collectivizing the risk. In fact, so perhaps. In fact, in this plan, the Food Sovereignty Council would hold the leaseholds of these farms, and the local authority would hand over the leaseholds. They'd also, perhaps, they'd be the ones who hold the fixed capital, and so there's a way of collectivising fixed capital, such as farm equipment and seeds, etc., etc. It would also be the body through which best practice around transitioning to agroecological practices would take hold, etc., etc. 1 minute. Yeah, and so this is a sort of proposition where at the moment we're sort of talking to and beginning to work with a couple of a farm and a farm which has got a CSA scheme in Hebden Bridge. It's in the very early stages of that, and perhaps you'd want to try to think about you'd be setting up, doing a proof of concept on that sort of thing. Because something like this would need to be, where you would need to persuade a local authority to make a big sort of gamble. But we think it's useful to try to think through that, in fact, you could actually see sort of quite a radical transformation into a sort of much more democratically organised food system. And this would just be for council farms, but it would be a step, a waypoint on a much wider sort of transformation. It seems incredibly radical, doesn't it? It seems incredibly utopian, but unfortunately, that is the situation we're in, is that we across all of our economic sectors, the situation we're in demands incredibly rapid and fundamental transformation over relatively short periods of time. So I think it's actually legitimate to be putting forward these sorts of propositions. I haven't got time to talk about the stuff on the Isle of Skye, but look at
Show us the pictures.
Look at this beautiful oyster table that Danny and Alan made up on the Isle of Skye, which is it's called the oyster table, and at high tide there's oysters growing in it. It's an oyster farm. At low tide the community can gather and eat. So it's that community control. And so the initial project we were talking about on Skye was to try to see if we could set up some commonly owned and governed agroecological farms, we'd say, so seaweed and oysters, etc. Stuff that would be regenerative environmentally regenerative, and of course what this the oyster table shows, it would also be socially regenerative. You're trying to, actually one of the things one of the projects on the Isle of Skye is to try to get replacements for things such as salmon farm, which is extractive, big industry, environmentally polluting, etc.
I would encourage everyone to ask Keir about that later today. Well done. Thank you so much, Keir, and to all of our speakers. Really, really interesting, really different presentations, but I think there are really interesting connections between them as well. Sorry that I had to cut you all short. I wish that we could listen to you all day. But I wanted to make sure that we had time for some questions. I've got a few, and then hopefully some of you in the audience will also have some questions. I think maybe the first one that we can start off with, sort of coming off Keir's presentation, which presents a really nice, quite well thought out vision for the future of the land and food system, sort of really clear framework for what it would look like if we were winning, one idea of that. But I'd like to see whether Christabel or Naomi, whether you have any sort of thoughts or ideas about, what would it look like, in your opinion, if the work that you were doing or the movements that you're working to represent and bring together, what would it look like if you were winning?
Yeah, I can say something to that. So I think I guess what exists in this country is that landlords and landowners have political power. So actually trying to make small changes even is really difficult. And we've seen that in the kind of Right to Roam campaign, where they've been trying to get a kind of similar act to Scotland, and they had some support from Labour at one point, but then Labour U-turned because of the power of because of the power of the National Farmers Union, and I think just even that is people are making decisions for landowners. Also, people with political power are landowners. And so, I think the way to see that we're winning is, to see how the movement grows and, how collective power develops. Mm-hmm. So, for us to be working on principles of collective liberation, that, land justice matters to everybody and to everything, and that, none of us are free until we're all free. And for that to be something that for people to in their local areas to be resisting, either about a single thing or to be kind of creating these more kind of comprehensive and inclusive systems locally, where decision making is becoming something for everyone around land. And I think. I guess for me, it's about the movement defining a clear direction and a clear strategy, and that people who are leading in the movement are from more marginalised background. I think that would be a sign that we're winning in the movement.
Thanks. Naomi, do you have any thoughts?
I'll just add to what Christabel said a little, because that's what I've been hearing recently from folks in communities, a devolution of power to that level, and the support and resources to be able to, come together and have their voices heard. At the same time, though, there is also a desire to not make these decisions in isolation, because then you have the one landowner making the decision without needing to reference downstream impacts, literally in the case of, say, flooding. So also to be able to weigh in and influence landscape scale decisions. And I'm going to come back to another thing that Cristobal alluded to. And I do think the idea of what land is really needs to change. The idea around what productivity is and what productive land is. I didn't really talk a lot about the meaning of land, but it has to be more than a resource. And Quakers in Scotland have said it has an intrinsic value in itself. First Nations people in Canada have called it ancestor, relative, it's foundational to culture. And I think there is some resonance to that in certain parts of Scotland. And new relations with land are definitely needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Naomi. So demands for justice, as you alluded to in your talk, Naomi, and as I think, we've all kind of referenced, demands for justice are always at risk of being co-opted or captured by capital or green capital. And in the case of land justice, I think we see this taking many forms, whether that be corporate rewilding schemes, like what you were talking about, using the feel-good language of participation in community to legitimize their land grabs, or a translation of demands for popular land sovereignty into claims for a democracy of landowners, which is far more palatable to the imperatives of capital that Keir was talking about. So I guess a question for all of you to answer in whichever way makes sense to you, but what are the effects of this risk and reality of co-option on movements and those involved in the struggle over land, and how might they respond? And whoever wants to can go first.
Probably my turn, isn't it?
Yeah, go.
It's like a huge problem, this, but we can also sort of reverse it.
Okay.
Because in some of these public-owned partnership projects, we're trying to enroll private capital. Actually, we're trying to get perhaps patient capital. You'll find sovereign wealth funds stocked by the exploitation of oil in terms of Norway, etc. We're trying to inculcate. We're trying to get at least some of that capital back. So you can, in some sort of way, you're trying to do a sort of like judo move on capital, and you're trying to co-opt its dynamics. And in fact, you can sort of see that a little bit where we're trying to democratize investment decisions, because investment decisions are what decide what the future looks like, what goes on, etc. And so, in some sort of way, you're trying to do a judo move, which of course opens you right up to being co-opted, etc., etc. So you have to be aware of what capital will or will not co-opt, what will or will not bear, basically, and what capital won't bear or will try to fight back against, or will basically not co-opt and try to defeat in more direct ways, are things which directly cramp its ability to expand, basically. And so if you think about the post-war period, the working classes gained huge amounts of power, like, we had the welfare state, etc. But all of that was structured in such a way that, in fact, the antagonism between capital and labour was actually a force for production. It, in fact, increased dramatically capital's productivity, right? Mm-hmm. So less money, like the sort of, working class, or the social surplus was being shared a little bit more equitably. But that dynamic was not interfering with the expansion of capital, right? That's what the post-war period sort of looks like. And I think so. What you think the thing that will protect you from co-optation is to build in the anticipation of what you're trying to do is in fact cramp self-expansion of capital, because you're trying to subordinate it and grow it even bigger. Mm-hmm. So in that, right, this is a very difficult move to make, because you want to do quiet politics, where you look very, very respectable, and you say, well, yes, this is for this marketplace, we think this will, hit these social value measures, impact measures, etc., etc., etc. And at a certain point, you want to do noisy politics, and you say, we must stop this. Mm-hmm. And getting those two right is a sort of balance, I think. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, thank you. Do you have any thoughts?
I guess what is going on at the moment is actually, there's a really good article written by Alex about this, of like how, large estate owners and corporations are buying up land, or they already have land, and they're taking government incentives, and they benefit from them, and they're also getting reputational benefit from rewilding, or doing kind of like biodiversity or conservation schemes. And this is kind of like greenwashing for them, but it's also greenwashing land ownership. Like it's like we're not actually questioning who's owning it. We're just going, okay, well it looks good because like there's links reintroduced into the countryside, and like the problem is that there's also like really prominent speakers and journalists who are advocating for this, like George Monbiot, and yeah, I think basically we need to kind of that's why we need to like stick with critiquing empire. Like it starts from there. We need to like look back at like the colonial ownership of the countryside, which Corinne Fowler has done, and look at like how corporations are continuing that colonialism in the UK as well as in other places. And yeah, when people in our movements are talking about nature reconnection, we kind of like need to ask them like, is this individualized? Is this also part of the problem? Are we reproducing harms? Or are we doing it collectively and are we questioning power? So I think like starting as a movement as like mimicking what we want to see in the world, which is like collectivizing and questioning power and ownership, and then that emulates out.
Yeah, absolutely. Naomi, do you have anything you want to contribute?
I think you do see this discourse in Scotland around greenwashing and the whole Green Lairds thing, harkening back to the power and control of the past. Has it had any effect? I'm not sure. I was at a conference last weekend on the Isle of Lewis, and Andy Whiteman spoke. If you don't know him, he's the kind of foremost land reform campaigner in Scotland. And he said Scottish people don't challenge power enough. I can't speak on behalf of Scottish people, but I feel like the know-how is there. The discourse is there. The challenges are, I guess, not being done where they need to be or not being heard.
Yeah. Okay, so I have other questions, but I'm hoping that the audience also has questions that they might like to ask our speakers. I'm not sure. Oh, we do have a roaming mic here, so maybe just raise your hand. And I think we had someone here at the front. Yeah.
I think we need a big picture of how land justice is undermined by the dominant framework and how it could be promoted in various ways. And here I refer to the slogan from 3 decades ago, popularized by the Zapatistas: one no and many yeses. But no against what? A central concept that we need is financialization, in particular land financialization, and that spans a broad range of actors, drivers, policies, and that's a crucial way to understand how we are already saying no to something which has those many forms, which have various disguises, increasingly green disguises. So in rural areas, the central driver has been the ELM scheme, which was meant to reduce carbon emissions or sequester them. And maybe it was, but it almost doesn't matter. It's become a pretext for land financialization, involving people who never had any connection to the land. It becomes irrelevant. And that irrelevance or relevance to financialization was built into the scheme, either consciously or unconsciously. It almost doesn't matter now. And in urban areas, financialization has many drivers, including so-called urban regeneration schemes, the rules on rents. And it's very easy to attack landlords, the private landlords, and say there shouldn't be landlords, and perhaps that's true. But the drivers include all the relevant actors, including local authorities, which are likewise financializing land in their own way for their own purposes. They increase the tax base. So I suggest we need an analytical and strategic focus on land financialization to understand what we all oppose in various forms, in various ways. And then many yeses, yes, certainly. We need to be more creative and imaginative about how to link the commoning in its various forms with state bodies. How can we instrumentalize state bodies and resources for a commoning project? Since we have experiments without state support or minimal state support. And those experiments are crucial towards pilot projects along the lines that Keir described. But we need to think of that progression from pilots, which are counter-hegemonic potentially, but become so in reality only when they gain the power to challenge financialization and create alternatives. How do we make those steps?
Yeah, really good point. I'm not sure exactly if there was a question in there, but if any of you have anything you'd like to respond anyway, go for it.
Well, I agree, Les. But yeah, and in a way we might, in a way, like when somebody once described this our proposal, public-common partnerships, as trying to hack financialization against itself, basically. So, and like one of the things I would say about one of the really big dangers, not just about land, but more generally about infrastructure, around the new Labour government's, around the new Labour government's policy program of de-risking. It is the thing that they've taken from Bidenomics and the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, etc. This idea that public capital should de-risk private investment, etc. And I mean, if you're watching the news, you'll see that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are meeting with the head of BlackRock and the huge asset management firms, and they're the ones who are going to build the infrastructure, and we're going to de-risk their control over the infrastructure. And this could take place on a really massive level. I mean, Bidenomics, the Inflation Reduction Act is really big sums potentially around the green transition. And like what the risk of what we're facing is that you have there's perhaps 5 asset management firms in the world basically, in controlling something like 40% of like the companies or the stocks on the in US stock exchanges, these sorts of things, and they're moving into infrastructure development. And what the risk of this program that Labour are proposing is that they will gain control of all of the key infrastructure on the green transition. They'll be the ones who control the new energy infrastructure. They'll be the ones who control the infrastructure being built to link up these new towns, etc. It'll be the big developers who will be building the new towns. And this is going to lead to a huge step up in financialization, a huge step up into inequality, or the funneling of wealth upwards, the creation of like these extractive rentier business models, etc. The rollback of democracy, because what these asset management firms are doing when they're moving into infrastructure, they're taking on the role of governments, but there's no democratic accountability at all. And if you want an idea of what happens when asset management companies control infrastructure, I present to you Thames Water, basically, because that's Macquarie, the big Australian asset management firm, controlled Thames Water. It's a shitty kind of bullshit abundance if you want to go and have a swim in the Thames.
Thanks, Keir.
Literally.
Christabel or Naomi, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just also that I agree. And I guess like the fact that land is a commodity and food is also a commodity is a problem. So then it can be played on the market. And so I think one role that we have as a movement is to create alternatives in like now, and to show that like land can be taken out of the market. And I think that there is a big role for like imagination, because like we live in a reality where so much of land is controlled by the market. So if we can try to create those alternatives, it can help us to dream as well. And so then we can think of a future when that's not the case.
Yeah. Naomi?
There's actually quite a lot of literature on financialization of land in the global north. I wouldn't say it's something unique, but just kind of the latest capitalist trend. And I don't think cogent critiques are lacking in the left in general. I wouldn't say that. I agree with Crystal. We need to see some stuff on the ground. And I think there are models coming out that may be scalable, not in the sense of suddenly there is a large cooperative landowner, but in the sense of networking. If we have to use a kind of market comparison, franchising.
Love it.
Can I just add one thing? I guess like when alternatives are being created, like community land trust or like housing co-ops, like often they aren't accessible to everyone, and I guess that is the issue that we're facing, that we cannot just like continue to accept that alternatives are only for the most privileged people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Are there more questions? I'm sorry, I can't see behind. Did you see who was first? Possibly over here in the back? Yeah. Sorry if I missed you behind my back.
Hello. Ah, great, it works. Hi, I just wanted to ask, most of the subjects of the talk so far have been focused on the UK, which is fair enough. But I also wanted to ask how is the panel sort of integrating sort of struggles over land in the global south into their perspectives on land reform? Just to give an example, I've been following quite closely expropriations of land in Indonesia by a company called the Vilmar Group, and this is a Singaporean-based company, and they have been seizing land that is farmed by the Indonesian Peasants Union, which is Via Campesina affiliate in Indonesia, representing sort of people in Sumatra, and they've been seizing land, pushing people off. It's completely illegal, and then planting palm oil trees, which of course are like the ingredients from everything from chocolate to soap to makeup. And as was mentioned in the introduction to this event, the UK's food system is extremely dependent on the importation of land, labour, and resources from the global south. It's essential to the sort of running of this country. So yeah, basically, I just wanted to ask how is sort of like the implications of the UK's capitalist system for land in the global south. How is that being integrated into your perspectives? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Catherine. It's a great question. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I think it's...
sorry, go. Sorry.
Can't see you.
I'm going to jump in before everyone steals all the great answers. I'm part of a research project that has just begun about a year ago, and it is in partnership with land activists in Tanzania and South Africa. And the idea is that a lot of those issues have been more recognized and more long-standing there, and we need to learn as Global North activists from what's going on there. And specifically, this is around community and communal land ownership. And so we've paired up with Scottish activists as well as these other activists. And I absolutely lost what I was going to say. Anyway, just reversing the flow of knowledge, I think, is extremely important. There's just some great examples of movements out there who've done amazing work. I mean, Via Campesina, obviously, in just having a movement that applies in different contexts and just has absolute solidarity at its base. I think a saying from 2009 was like, there is no food sovereignty without the end to violence against women, for example. Mm-hmm. So there's models out there for sure that we can look at.
Mm. Thanks, Naomi. And if what you were going to say comes back to you, you can always have another go.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think we could be doing more. So I guess that all the different kind of parts of the ecosystem have different focuses and might be working like in international solidarity with others in different parts of the global south independently. And like I know that's the case. There's Miknaf Haaretz, which is like a Jewish land movement in the UK who have like very strong ties with Palestine and what's going on there at the moment. And yeah, there are kind of organisation called Prela who are fighting for Planet Repairs, which is like a framework for reparations, and they have really strong ties with different continents. And yeah, it's something that we've tried to do recently. So we've kind of met up as like a very small collective of people in the land justice movement with Kenyan activists who want to kind of create a mutual solidarity And it feels like, you know, these are ways forward where we can like not just talk about like colonial histories and like the reason why there's wealth accumulation in this country is also to do with slavery and colonialism, but also like act to stop corporate power that's global, and yeah, kind of governments who continue to extract and exploit land overseas. But yeah, I think it does feel a bit like we need to have a bit more like cohesiveness in the way that we work in the UK to be more effective at international solidarity.
Yeah, it's a great question. Some of the inspirations for when we've been trying to think through public-common partnerships in the UK, and particularly like the principles of transition that we've been trying to think through in terms of this contesting reproduction and building popular protagonism. You know, quite a lot of the inspirations come from social movements in the global south, particularly around the Venezuela commune system. There's a commune system in Venezuela. And in fact, they use the terms contested reproduction and popular protagonism because those terms come from a theorist called Istvan Messeros, who met with Chavez during his later days. And when he realized he was dying, Chavez says we need to change the form of the revolution to make it survivable, and we need to distribute democratic planning to this commune system. It's very interesting, actually. And then there's a sort of decentralized democratic planning, economic planning system in Kerala in India as well, which is incredibly extensive and incredibly interesting experiment. And of course, we're quite inspired sort of tactically by organizations such as the MST in Brazil. But then you think, well, how do you translate that to the UK? I don't think we're going to see land invasions. I can imagine the sort of violent response we'll get. Not that they don't get a violent response in Brazil, obviously. And so one of the other ways in which we try to think that through is another movement which is not in the global south. It's in Berlin, and it's a campaign called the Berlin Wohnen and Co. Eintigen. I've probably murdered that movement, but it's around socializing and expropriating and socializing excess housing. And so, in fact, it took the form of like legal activism rather than sort of like physical direct action. It was reinterpretation of a clause of the German Constitution, which had the clauses around public use of housing, actually. And so they drew up a proposal for any landlord who had more than 3,000 properties in Berlin, that would be expropriated from them, and that 3,000 houses would be socialized. And they organized a referendum, and they won that referendum. Then after you win a referendum, you get bogged down in, well, we're not going to implement that. And now they've reshaped, and they're onto the next stage to try to force that through, which would be an absolutely incredible change in Berlin housing. It would really shift things, the dynamics in Berlin housing. We're quite a long way from expropriating large landowners, green lairds in the UK. Even to get close to that, you'd have to break this sort of alliance between very, very big landholders, your Jeremy Clarksons, and like active working farmers, etc. We'd have to break that link and say, well, look, you know, perhaps your situation would be eased a bit, actually, if we could seize control over some of this land ownership, which traces back, you know, if you think about in Scotland, to quite illegitimate seizing by force of common land, etc., and the clearances and these sorts of things. So you could, like, you know, just imagine it imagining, you could sort of think about that sort of like, how do you build a pressure for that sort of, to build a demand for a much more equitable land, access to land, etc., through things such as referendums and these sorts of things.
Yeah, thanks, Keir. We're running short on time, so I might try to gather up a few questions and then put them to the audience. We've got a lot, maybe more than we can get to, but we'll try. So just raise your hands and I'll... Okay, so we've got one here, which I know has been for a while, and then one over there and one in the middle here. So maybe I'll pass... Keir, can you pass me that microphone and I'll just pass it over here.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. I'm Tim Waterman from the Bartlett and from the Landscape Research Group. And I just wanted to put out a couple of questions maybe for the whole day. And first of all, just to think about what technologies we need or what technologies need to be modified in order to effect a just transition, because I think that's important alongside the political and cultural aspects and the economic aspects. And then the other question is to do with the fact that actually what a lot of is that agriculture and food production are not necessarily synonymous, and what a lot of agriculture does is anything but food production. So how do we address that question, and what are the problems there? So I think there's probably not time enough to answer both of those big questions, but I think it's useful to have them on the table.
Absolutely. Then I think there was someone down the back there, and then some in the middle here as well.
Thank you all so much. I'll try and be as brief as possible. It's touching a lot on the last point made by Keir. And I'm an academic, just to say, working on agrarian change in the Global South, specifically South India and Cambodia. One of the regions I study has had a historically very strong farmers' movement. My main question, based on some of my own thinking on this, and I'm coming to the UK context quite recently and kind of excited to start working on it, is this question, the political question, basically. Because where you see success in the Global South, and we hear a lot about Latin America, for example, you generally, MST, Zapatista, and so on, have a large constituency of farmers that already kind of have a marginalized or subaltern identity within a kind of modern state. And so there is a natural linking of subalternity or marginalization, agrarian struggles over land, and so on. And from my kind of understanding of the British case, the UK case, we don't have that, right? So trying to transpose the kind of politics of Global South marginalized studies onto the actual people who own land in this country, I'm talking about family farmers all the way to, Clarkson, Dyson, and so on, it doesn't seem possible to me. And so I just, and then the kind of second linked point is, we have a Keir Starmer Labour government. Any chance we had of having any kind of space for these kinds of discussions within Labour is largely extinguished. There's a kind of political battle to evict us all. I've just seen that Louise Haigh, who's kind of vaguely probably the most left-wing person in the cabinet, has just resigned over something that seems quite small. So politically, in terms of, trying to action this through, how do we begin to translate this to a meaningful approach to actually speaking to the farmers we have here in this country? Thank you.
Thank you. Really good question, and I would say like a large part of why the Root and Branch Collective exists. So you're on point. There was a couple in the middle here, I think, and then we'll try to quickly answer as much as we can of them before we break.
Yeah, thank you all. I've just got a question really which relates to Olivia. You introduced the session with some data. And I was just wondering, actually, if you have any data in terms of the ownership of riverbeds as to kind of extend the idea of the land to the water, and where the ownership of riverbeds and where the kind of ideas of the commons, where exactly is it bordered and bounded? Thank you.
Was there one other? Yeah.
I guess it's a sort of question, but it follows on from the Landscape Research Group and many other thoughts. I run a small arts organisation that's based on 2 housing estates in East London, around which we have a community garden and a food bank. And I'm always working with local people to try to think differently, to create a new imaginary of how even the small amounts of land that are so-called in the public, in the commons realm there, can be used differently. And I think I'm really mindful that sometimes we want to have these huge, fantastic, highly progressive, radical projects which have a far-reaching consequences for change. But actually, there are also ways to work in the very, very local, which can come together, if you like, to bring multiple community voices from small projects that can enable us all to think differently about how we work, not necessarily to transpose. Absolutely agree with the person sitting against the wall over there. We can't transpose things and hope and float them on top of the UK situation. It's never going to work in that way, but we can be inspired. And where I am, for instance, I'm working primarily with a group of women on these estates to become the researchers around extractivism, around thinking differently, so that they can make their own contribution to the shaping of a local project, the growing of foodstuffs for their food bank, the political collective coming together, really, to think differently about why we have these bloody food banks, why they're not going away. In other words, it comes from the bottom up, and that has to be slow. And it starts to make quite radical change, but in small ways that bring new voices to the table, to the ground, literally. Yeah. And I think that perhaps part of the answer to lots of our questions is that we need more of these projects, which then become the pilots, the radical pilots, that can inform our own coming together and making of policy and strategy.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think I won't take any more of the hour anymore because we won't have time. I'll just really quickly speak to the question about rivers, and then maybe each of you can have 2 minutes to speak to whatever you want from the rest of the questions. And obviously these guys are going to be around later, so people can come up to them and, well, Naomi won't be, but ask questions. So just on... Oh, yeah, and also there's post-it notes where people can ask more questions or put their own answers to the questions that have been asked so far. So just on rivers, I don't know a huge amount about it in the UK. I think the Right to Roam campaign talks about 97% of rivers in the UK are like private. So it's basically all of them. If you're interested in this kind of thing, it might be interesting to look at the situation in New Zealand, because foreshore and rivers, it's all part of something called the Queen's Chain, so it's not able to be privately owned, including the beds of rivers and lakes. Obviously this has complications because it's indigenous land that was stolen, so that makes it a lot more complex, but it's quite a different system than what you have here, so it might be worth looking into. Now I'm just going to go right to left along here, or left to right, and yeah, just like 2 minutes to try and address as much as you want to or can from what's been said.
Yeah, I think just to respond to that question of like, should we be looking at these like really radical, like far-reaching, like big, like kind of big visions, when actually what it takes is building practical spaces, like especially when art is involved or where people can see things differently, like by being involved. I think that's like really vital, and like holding on to those spaces that is harder and harder. And I think part of the movement's struggle is to stop evictions of those spaces and like counter gentrification around those spaces so that they can continue to exist. And I think part of the thing about being in a movement that's like, the system is so hard to shift that we do need to have those really like far-reaching, dreamy goals, but also to see that and not lose sight of them. And to see that the small, incremental changes and like these kind of like diverse solutions that are popping up all over the place is also part of that. I guess the thing that can happen is that if you think that the like immediate small changes are it, then it becomes like a kind of liberal answer rather than like a revolutionary or a radical answer. Yeah. But yeah, that like also just reconnecting with land and having opportunities to do that and build new relationships with land. That's what's happening in these spaces, which is like we've become so alienated, and like communities have been broken down by the fact that like land is organized and controlled by the market. So yeah, often people like are living in community and then it's gentrified, they have to move away. So like this is also a way of creating the community in order to kind of organise and resist. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll just agree with you. I mean, it's the bind we're in, isn't it? Is that like organising? It is very, very difficult, and it takes time, in order to organise and bring different people together, etc. And at the same time, we are under this incredible time pressure from climate change and the other ecological crises to bring about transformations in incredibly short amounts of periods of time. That's the bind we're in, which is why we have to I think we have to like make proposals which are quite forward thinking, and like, where the steps to get into them are not particularly clear. But, we also have to start here and now, when we try and do these we're talking to a small farm in Hebden Bridge of a small CSA and a care farm in North Yorkshire. These are quite relatively small projects. When we do urban development propositions, that's usually as part of an anti-gentrification campaign where people are coming together and they're saying, right, we don't want this. Well, what do you want? Well, now you've got to come up with a community plan, etc. You know what I mean? You have to. So that's the proposition we're making with these public common partnerships. These are forms which make sense now, which can be brought into being now and can be useful now for solid specific struggles, but they have an anticipation built into them in institutional design even of being something else, of being able to grow something quite big, I think. And I think that's the sort of approach you need, basically, to be able to act now, be useful now, but also have dynamics built in to expand quite quickly. And just quickly, just on the riverbed thing, you're right. I think it's like 3% of river banks are accessible to the public, like 7% of land is accessible to the public, something like that. We did a little bit of work when we were on the Isle of Skye, and we were trying to think through these agroecological farms, seaweed farms, oyster farms. We made some proposals to the Scottish Government's Community Wealth Building Bill about how do we common the foreshore, the sort of like how do you make usage rights of the foreshore common, etc. And I think that is something that's quite possible, to sort of change the use of the foreshore. In Scotland, it's sort of interesting because it's like the Queen, no, the King now, isn't it? Yes. It's the Crown Estate owns the foreshore, but like because of the Scottish Government, it's in some sort of, and there's an unsure. We're not sure exactly who's actually in control of that. There's a time to make an intervention into that and say that that there should be some sort of democratic governance and common usage rights to the foreshore.
Thanks.
You could imagine that around water, perhaps. Around rivers, sorry, perhaps.
Okay, and Naomi, you'll go.
I appreciate the point about the farmer subaltern identity in the global south. One of the reasons I thought Scottish land reform would not work in my home province of Saskatchewan is that communities don't have the identity of, say, communities in the Western Isle of Scotland who've been there for generations and engage in crofting, that sort of thing. I think that what has gotten traction in Canada and possibly here is the politics around climate and the biodiversity crisis. So that's where the radical farmers movement in Canada has been heard. And I think when we talk about agriculture, first, not all land in Scotland for sure is agricultural land. Very relatively little of it. And I think there's differentiation between the types of producers as well. Someone who is perhaps farming livestock extensively is closer to the environment, to the changes in the environment, and more likely to change actions, for example. So thank you for allowing me to explicate that a little. I will also say that I am on the live stream in the chat if anyone does want to contact me at some point in the day, or, just find me, Google me.
That's great. Sorry for saying that you couldn't be contacted, Naomi, and thank you all the panelists for your really wonderful presentations and responses to the questions. Catherine, also there is a panel on that last up, so hopefully that will contribute to answering some of those questions as well. And I'm going to wrap it up there. Sorry it's taken so long. Okay, so yeah. I hear we're going to be back at 1:20, so you all still have lots of time for lunch and chatting.